Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be with everyone for another Performance Excellence Forum. I'm joined today by Dr. Matt Della, who will be speaking with us today on this great topic. And I want to remind everyone, this is part of a three-part series that GRQC will be hosting over the coming months. We're starting with today really focused on, I think, where it all starts. Your talent, whether you're in healthcare, manufacturing, business services. The talent, as we know right now, is so much a part of the capital that makes a business competitive and successful. And so we're really starting today with Dr. Matt Della talking about employee morale. And then in the future sessions, we're going to be having some future sessions on topics related to both recruitment and onboarding, as well as additional training for employees. So I really look forward to having all of you join us for the next two sessions in the coming months as we work as a community to focus on ways to invest in our existing talent, attract new talent to our workplace, and continue to invest in their growth and development, which we know will make the enterprise and the nonprofits that are in our community that much more competitive. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Matt Della with us today, the co-founder of Lean Positive LLC, for our forum on applying quality improvement tools to help improve employee morale. This is an entity that I'm pleased to know. I'm a member of Matt's family. I worked with him at Butler Till for a number of years. And then Matt Lenars, the other co-founder, who's also on the call. His spouse was another former colleague. So I have some personal connection with these gentlemen who have been working very hard to, really revisit what quality can mean for talent. And this fits very well with our mission here at GRQC to stimulate and foster excellence in the products, services, and processes of all organizations and businesses in our community. And there's never been a more important time than now to focus on the issue of talent and employee investment. The GRQC is made up of members like many of those on the call today, from our large employers, from our health systems, from our nonprofit community. They're focused on the collaboration and demonstration of proven quality improvement methods and sharing that knowledge with as many people as possible. So do feel free to visit our website at grqc.org to learn more and check out future events. And then without further ado, let me introduce our presenter this morning, Dr. Matt Della, who has used his expertise in happiness and positive psychology to assist organizations in boosting employee engagement for bottom line results. He earned his social science PhD studying under Dr. Sanja Lyubomirsky, one of the world's top positive psychology researchers. And Dr. Della has provided expertise to business culture, consultancies, and affiliation with world-renowned human potential expert Sean Acker and the late Tony Hsieh, who many of you may know from the company Zappos. He has also provided on-site consulting services for organizations including Nationwide Insurance and T-Mobile, and he recently co-founded Lean Positive LLC with Matt Lenars LSSBB in 2020. So without further ado, I'll stop my screen sharing and let Dr. Della put his screen up. Dr. Della, and for those of you, we do have some interactive questions that Matt will be posting. We're going to come back to your questions at the end of the speaker portion, but do feel free to use the chat as a way to engage and participate in today's presentation from Dr. Della. So without further ado, Dr. Della.
Thank you, David, and thanks for everyone here who is attending today. Very excited to speak to you all. I was talking to Dick as we were waiting for everyone to get on, and I was telling him that this the fact that I'm sitting here presenting right now is kind of a funny story because what my partner Matt Lenars and I like to say is that we never should have met. We come from completely different backgrounds and approaches to value creation, and that's actually what Lean Positive is all about. So as you can see here, what we're trying to do today is apply the quality improvement tools that so many of you know very well, specifically for the task of improving employee morale. So to kick things off, I'd like to start with a situation that might seem actually a little bit unfamiliar, and that's when everything goes exactly right. So I'd like to give you an example here of a process having to do with people where everything goes just right. So for starters, let's say that an employee does an excellent job for a customer. And each time I give you one of these little tidbits, I'm going to ring a bell. And then toward the end, I'm going to ask you, okay, what does this bell represent? So if the employee does an excellent job for a customer, ding, ding. If then that customer leaves an outstanding review and has repeat service for that organization, ding, ding. If the organizational leader gives that employee who did such a great job recognition, ding, ding. That employee who was thinking about leaving, moving on to greener pastures, decides to actually stay, ding. If that recognized employee does a great job for even more customers, ding. If that organization continues to grow due to great customer service, among other things, that's a ding. And then lastly, if that organization invests even more in employee recognition and they get even better at it, that's definitely a ding. So what was happening each time there was a ding? And I'll go ahead and answer that question. Value was received. And what I hope you can see here is that at Lean Positive, we try to take a very holistic look at what value means and for whom you can create it. To that end, I'd like to give you kind of the initial pitch for what exactly we do here at Lean Positive. So if you know my partner, Matt Lenars, you know he has a robust background in Lean. He's worked for GE and Xerox and is doing some independent consultant work currently. And he comes from the process or Lean approach. And I myself, I have a background in positive psychology, as David mentioned. I have a PhD in social science. And after I graduated, I decided I wanted to transition into industry because I heard, oh yeah, you know, all these companies really want positive cultures and they want to look to the science to see how they can do that. So I kind of went on my own little journey until I wandered into Quality for Leaders one fateful day, and I got plugged into the local quality community. So although my partner and I come from two very different approaches, we started talking and realized that him and I were not so different after all, and that we were both after the same thing, which is value creation. And as we continued to talk, we thought, you know, even though we have two very different approaches to value creation, there's got to be a way that we can combine them into one cohesive methodology. And that's what we've done with Lean Positive. So to set the agenda here today, we'll talk about today's challenges and opportunities for leadership. We'll take a look at value, and again, we'll have a very kind of basic conversation about it. But my hope is that we'll have a good look at what exactly it means to create value and for whom we can create it. I'll give a bit of an overview on my thoughts regarding the process approach and the people approach to value creation. I'll tell you a bit more about Lean Positive, and we're going to be sure to leave lots of time for questions. And as David mentioned, what we'll be doing is I will be asking you questions throughout the presentation. Please do chime in the chat to either ask questions yourself or provide answers for the questions that I ask. And what we'll do is we'll come back to those toward the end of the presentation after my prepared remarks are finished. So let's begin with those leadership challenges and opportunities. You've heard it before, so I'll be brief on this subject, but of course we all know about the Great Resignation going on. A couple of statistics that have caught our eye is, for starters, the voluntary turnover rate is over 25%. And that right there is a pretty alarming number, but it also just speaks to, again, just how many employees are dissatisfied with their work conditions and the organizations that they work for, and how employee engagement and these questions around how to take care of your employees. When I first got started, they used to be, oh, well, that's nice to have. But now I think we're pretty much to the point now where this is a non-negotiable. We got to figure out some way to drive this number down. To that end, what's another interesting data point is that over half of them exiting employees say that basically nobody spoke to them about their job satisfaction and the last 3 months before they left. Also, again, over half of them say, hey, someone could have said something to prevent me from leaving. But as we just saw, not a whole lot of that is happening. So to us, there's an obvious problem here, but also obvious opportunities and solutions that could be implemented to drive these figures down. So that brings us to our discussion regarding value. And what I hope to see here is that we'll have a new look at value and maybe challenge some of the assumptions that we typically hold about what value is and for whom to create it. So I'm going to tell you some things you already know, given that you're quality professionals, but just bear with me because I'm going to always compare the process approach to what I specialize in, which is the people approach. So typically the process approach is going to use 5 major categories of metrics to assess quality, ranging from safety, quality, delivery, cost, and notably there is a category for the employee. I've also provided here an evidence-based framework from the American Psychological Association regarding, okay, what are similarly the categories of metrics that we ought to be looking at in terms of providing a psychologically healthy workplace. So as you can see, the people approach is of course very employee oriented, while the process approach tends to be more customer oriented. Now, with that said, I would like for you to provide in the chat how you would define value, especially if it differs a bit from what I just showed you. And moreover, for whom should we be creating value? If you had to say choose between customers or employees, or of course, maybe you think we should be doing it for both. So to that end, let's talk about the process improvement approach and what its pros and cons are, at least from my standpoint. So typically, as I mentioned, who's getting the value in the process improvement approach? It's the customer, and with good reason, as we'll see. You, of course, know that these are some of the common improvement methodologies that are used to create that customer value. These tools, I'm sure, all look familiar to you regarding what you can actually do. What are the tools and methodologies you can implement to create that customer value? And moreover, why would you use the process improvement approach? Well, the typical point is that, well, if you can deliver customer value, that's of course going to benefit the organization as well. That's, business 101, no surprise there. If you've heard my spiel before, and I know some of you on this call have, you know where I'm going, that the process approach has a people problem. And this is actually not my original thought. It was when I got plugged into the local quality community that I first began to understand, oh, okay, I specialize in the people side of things, but these process folks are saying, hey, there does seem to be a people problem. So that right away is when I started to think, okay, maybe there's something that I could help contribute here. But my partner, Matt Lenars, actually showed me that it's not so much that the process approach devalues people of any sort. If you're familiar with the Toyota Way 2001 model, you'll know that value creation is supported by 2 pillars, which are supposed to receive equal emphasis: continuous improvement and respect for people, namely employees. However, in our estimation, the Toyota Way actually looks a little bit more like this, because that all-important value creation it is affected if you're not equally emphasizing respect for people with continuous improvement. Speaking of Toyota, we found some really great quotes that I'm sure many of you have seen already. My personal favorite sums it up in 4 words: before cars, make people. That is a beautiful quote, and I think if taking more seriously, the respect for people issue would be a non-issue. We also find a couple other ones that are really great too, and these sorts of sentiments really do remind me of the sort of things that are talked about on the people side of things. You want a home-like atmosphere at work that's warm and friendly. I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that positive psychologists would say as well. We also saw, digging into this a little bit, that a lot of the latest lean thought leadership is about respect for people and how to instigate things that help provide engagement, specifically in a lean context. Now, the problem is that a lot of these articles, although they contain good information, they typically take the form of, listicles, top 5 ways you can show respect to employees in a lean environment. And while those can be helpful to share around and take a look at yourself, they lack a cohesive solution, right? And that's what we're after at Lean Positive. So one question I have is, if you wouldn't mind chiming in the chat, when have you seen a people problem in the process approach? And as I mentioned, a few of you have actually confided such things to me, so don't be shy in sharing a little bit about where have you seen a people problem or a lack of respect for people, let's say, in the process approach. Now, let's talk about the people approach. And if you thought I was being a bit critical of the process approach, wait till you hear me address the people approach, because although this is my background, having worked in this industry for many, many years, I can tell you that there are some serious shortcomings with the people approach as well. So let's give this the same treatment that we just had with the process approach. Who's getting the value in the people approach? Well, of course, the emphasis is not so much on customers, it's on employees. How do you take care of your people? Now, how the people approach creates value, typically, if they want to be evidence-based, is through some implementation of positive psychology. Here's the school, University of California, Riverside, where I did my graduate work and my dissertation. And the basic gist of positive psychology is one of the founders, Dr. Martin Seligman, defines it as the scientific study of optimal human functioning. And I think that's a pretty good way to go. Psychology, historically, especially if you look at guys like Freud or B.F. Skinner, they had a fairly dark view of humanity. And it wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that psychologists began to say, hey, let's start studying the more positive ends of humanity as well and try to balance out that picture of humanity a little bit more. So that's what I became interested in. And we would start doing studies on not just what makes people happy, but moreover, what we were interested in is how and why things like gratitude, optimism, and kindness work so well to make people happier. I already showed you one of these models for what the people approach looks like. I'm going on my way to show you evidence-based approaches. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there that is not evidence-based. So I already showed you the model put out by the American Psychological Association. My former colleague, Peggy Kern, came up with an empirically validated assessment called the PERMA model of well-being. And you can see here that this can be used in the workplace to look at things like positive emotions, engagement, and accomplishment. So just like we asked before, well, why use the people approach? Well, the saying goes that happy employees are productive employees. In other words, if you can deliver value to employees, that's going to help your bottom line. The organization will also gain value. But I'm here to tell you that the people approach has a process problem. And this is something I began to understand the more I learned about lean, because lean provides insights into value creation that the people approach, frankly, knows nothing of. So for example, let's say you have a really powerful workshop that transforms the culture and people are really psyched, and I've seen it. I've seen the workshops where people are hugging and they're crying and they're so happy and they can't believe that their bosses hired us to come in and talk to them about happiness at work. But then what happens when you go back to work on Monday morning? What happens when things change? What if there's a change in leadership and the new leadership doesn't care so much about culture change using positive psychology? What if the organization you just spent so much time driving culture change in gets absorbed into a larger company? What happens if there's an emergency or a huge problem and people are putting out fires all week? Efforts at culture change, in my experience, tend to go by the wayside pretty fast, and things revert back to the way they were when the real work needs to happen, let's say. So in my opinion, really, a lot of culture change initiatives, frankly, are a bit too brittle and can't withstand the changes that are a matter of course for most organizations. Now, some people would say, well, that's why you got to focus on culture, because culture, in a sense, is where the people and processes come together. And that's what we would always try to do as positive culture change experts, is we'd say, hey, you know, it's one thing to put the ping pong table in the break room. How do we embed this stuff into the way work actually gets done? That's really what efforts at culture change are supposed to do. And you can see a lot of benefits there. It's not like culture doesn't matter. Of course it does. But if you've seen documentaries like this, and I highly recommend this Hulu one on WeWork, this is actually a pretty good case study on an organization that, oh yeah, they took culture very, very seriously, to the point where they kind of forgot to run an ethical organization that cared about financials. So we don't want to go too far with culture, although of course culture matters a great, great deal. That's another question I have for you, is what experience do you have as quality professionals using the people approach to create value, especially if you're someone who really does subscribe to the Toyota way and respect for people? And I'd love for you to share some of your learnings, if you're comfortable, in the chat. One other question I have for you is when, and this is a kind of a tricky one, when have you seen a process problem in the people approach? That meaning, when have you seen people or employee value creation essentially fizzle out by the time it's time to get the real work done regarding customer value creation and what makes the organization directly profitable? So now that we've taken a look at the people and process approaches, I'd love to share with you a bit more about what it is that we do at Lean Positive, because we try to recognize the relative strengths of both of these approaches and minimize their weaknesses in what we do. All right, so here is what we call the workplace ecosystem. And we call it the ecosystem because it involves three key stakeholders: the employees, the customers, and the organization. And as you can see, each stakeholder group depends on the other for value creation and for them to receive value. So of course, we have employees creating customer value. Customers, of course, contribute the value to the organization by providing financial resources for that organization via purchases and all that sort of thing. And then, of course, the organization is responsible for providing value for employees, and around it goes. Now, where we really put a lot of our emphasis is on the organization's role in creating employee value. To that end, we break down employee value into two really important categories. And we believe that basically any efforts that an organization makes to create value for employees can be broken down into these two categories. The first is transactional value. Transactional value is essentially the things that make an organization viable in the first place to have employees. So they're offering competitive wages, they're offering benefits, they're offering basic workplace safety. Transactional value is indispensable because without it, you don't really have a functioning for-profit business. However, we also want to make room for something we call human value. Human value basically captures all the sorts of things that go above and beyond transactional value in terms of trying to create a workplace that employees, for example, feel engaged, a sense of belonging, a sense of loyalty to the organization, and all the kinds of things you hear people talk about. The way we approach this is through two forms of human value. The first is what we call needs supported, and that's referring to the three basic psychological needs that every person has, which I'll get to in a little bit. And that's a very strong positive psychology theory that we use there. We also use something a little bit more tangible to track human value, and that's something we call information flow. That is the question of whether individuals in the organization are sharing information that's timely, accurate, and relevant with each other. So if we were to expand our understanding of employee value to include transactional value and human value, you would get an ecosystem that looks like this. You will also notice that I've included a third arrow going from employees back to the organization that wasn't there before. And that, I think, is a really important point for us to understand here, is that organizations, of course, are not just receiving value from customers, they're receiving value, ideally, right back from employees. And we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that value looks like when it's being created by employees for the organization. So I mentioned three basic psychological needs. If you fill these psychological needs or help support these psychological needs, that is creating human value. You might be asking where I got these needs from. This is based on a very, very well-researched theory in positive psychology called self-determination theory. These might look a little bit familiar to you if you're familiar with Daniel Pink's work. He called these autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But the basic idea here is that these are three buckets that have been found across multiple contexts, dozens of countries, and pretty much anywhere you find yourself, you can see glimpses of one or more of these basic psychological needs. So as a brief summary, autonomy is that desire people have to feel a sense of choice in what they do each day and to look back upon they do with a sense of approval and endorsement of the choices that they made. Competence is that desire we have to feel effective and capable regardless of the situation that we find ourselves in. And relatedness, in my opinion, the one that perhaps matters most in this day and age, is that desire people have to feel understood and appreciated at work. And certainly any kind of efforts regarding employee recognition and appreciation would fall into that bucket. So we're going to begin to show you how we use the lean approach to apply positive psychology to specific people processes. In a broad sense, here's what it looks like. We draw some inspiration from SciPoc to identify what the inputs are in this process and what are the desired outputs. So if we kind of work backwards here, you'll recognize the two forms of human value that I explained earlier. That's the idea that you're having your psychological needs supported. We like to say that it's filling your need buckets. So that's why we have a full bucket there. And we also have that information flow, again, the timely and accurate and relevant sharing of information. Now, the question is, how do you get these outputs? Well, it has to do with the process steps for whatever people process that you're dealing with. And in a little bit, I'll show you several examples of people processes and leadership processes that we've been setting our efforts toward. But in general, regardless of what process you're talking about, there's always going to be opportunities to do basically two things. It's the supporting of psychological needs based on the way that you communicate, the choice of words you do, the way that you communicate with people in general, and also the sharing of information in ways that, again, are relevant and timely for the situation. And the inputs are fairly obvious. You start with basic leadership skills which would then lead into supporting of the psychological needs. And you have some sort of starting information that some people may or may not be privy to, and a choice regarding how that information is shared. So what we're trying to show here is that there is a systematic way that you can approach human value creation in the same way that you would apply quality tools to creating customer value. Here we're doing the same thing, but creating human value for employees. We have several leadership process categories. And as you can see, we have quite a range of them, but the ones that we're interested in particular in the lower right-hand corner, the leading leadership process categories, which include things like employee feedback, employee reward and recognition, and others that are highly employee-centric and have a lot to do with engagement and retention. In particular, out of those four, we're going to show you a detailed example of how we've redesigned employee feedback to create more human value. Speaking of employee feedback, let's talk a little bit more in depth about that. What we mean by employee feedback are those frequent touch points between a leader and an employee. So there are those touch points that might be anything from a daily one-on-one to a weekly chat. The point is that they are the touch points in between the quarterly or annual kind of more formal performance reviews. And something else we really want to emphasize is that employee feedback involves communication not just for employees from the manager, but also eliciting feedback from employees toward their managers. We believe that organizations should be benefiting from employee feedback in at least two ways. One of them is fairly obvious. Of course, if you're having a really successful employee feedback session, that ought to drive down turnover, because those are the opportunities for managers to instill a sense of confidence in that employee, help them feel a sense of belonging and purpose and all the kinds of things that you hear people talking about. And ultimately, it can really help that employee make a decision regarding whether or not they want to stay. The other aspect of this that we're really excited to talk to you about is something we like to call frontline intelligence. Frontline intelligence, and this is the second way that employees can actually be driving value right back to the organization. It's the critical information that only employees can see from their unique vantage points. It can be anything ranging from problem identification, waste identification, could be ideas for improvements, could be something extremely important, customer feedback. We all know how important it is to hear the voice of the customer. So we believe frontline intelligence is absolutely indispensable, because it's not only going to keep the organization competitive by hearing the voice of the customer, it could also prevent a potential disaster. If you've seen that documentary on Netflix about Boeing, you know that Boeing paid over $3 billion basically to correct a mistake that could have been prevented had they had a culture more inclined toward people speaking up. So the question is, how do you actually get these benefits? How do you use employee feedback to lower turnover and elicit frontline intelligence? Well, we want to use the same approach that we would use to a process to create customer feedback, but we want to do it specifically for employee feedback to create employee value, specifically human value for employees. So the target results, as we've been talking about, are delivering human value. Those are the needs met in the information flow. We also want to make sure we're encouraged that frontline intelligence sharing so that the organization can directly benefit. And the way we're going to redesign this process are things that you're already familiar with, particularly process documentation. That's capturing the fundamentals of the employee feedback process. What are the general steps that all managers are supposed to be taking? In other words, what are the standard operating procedures or work instructions for employee feedback? Secondly, we want to have something we like to call need support guidelines. So we don't at all want to force managers to say certain things. We want managers to be able to use their own unique leadership styles and bring their best abilities to these employee feedback sessions. But we do want to have some sort of guidelines for how to actually conduct these employee feedback sessions so that you're getting those two target results. And lastly, we want to make sure we're defining and capturing the measurements that show success with the employee feedback. So those could be metrics specific to the basic process, so the number of sessions that that manager is conducting, the quality of the session according to the employee, was that delivery of the session satisfactory to the employee. We also, of course, would want to take a look at things like engagement, involuntary turnover, and absenteeism as proxies for how successful that employee feedback process is going. So we'd like to show you now a detailed example of what this actually looks like. Here you'll see we've used something called Action Map, which is a great tool, one of our tech partners, where basically you can create an interactive SIPOC for any process. So we did so with the employee feedback process. And what we see here is that we have a number of things going on, but where I want to draw your attention to is the middle part of this diagram, where you see the individual steps that a manager ought to be taking to conduct the employee feedback session. And in fact, several of these steps are emphasizing what you need to do in preparation for that session. Then, of course, a big emphasis is on conducting the feedback session itself. And we also have steps that capture the follow-up that needs to happen, both in terms of following up with the employee and reporting the results of that session to management. So to wrap up, looking back at our ecosystem here, what we have, if we take a look at a process specifically that we want to redesign to create human value, what employees get is, of course, that human value that we talked about. What the customers get is that greater value from employees because they're being properly motivated and they have their psychological needs met and they have the information that they need to do their jobs well. And what you get as an organization is twofold. It's not just the value that you get from customers, which every organization can come to expect. But in this case, we also have organizations receiving that frontline intelligence that we talked about and experiencing the lower costs benefits of lower turnover. So to wrap up my discussion here and go over to what you've been talking about in the chat, we'd like to ask you, do you see value here? And in particular, what we are developing is what we like to call a turnkey toolkit, which would essentially comprise an online course and would include downloadable templates so that anybody interested in taking on their employee feedback process and redesigning it to create human value would be able to go through this online course and download the materials and walk themselves through it. So it would include things like creating a swim lane diagram for that process. It would walk them through developing those process guidelines. You would create a SIPOC and ultimately end up with a leader standard work checklist. So we'd love to hear your comments on how much value you see in something like this and ultimately who might even pay for it. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and I'd love to hear your questions and some of your responses to my questions earlier. Thank you.
As we get some questions in the chat here, I'm just capturing some of the key takeaways that we had here throughout the key themes, starting with how do we define value, current state, what are some of the problems we see between that friction that can be caused between people-based needs and process-based needs, and what are some of the challenges that people have seen as they start to maybe bring in some aspects of positive psychology. I think people like Adam Grant have become, with psychological safety, have become more prevalent. So I know many people here have mentioned, that they've seen practice like this brought into the organization. So, and we heard a few different things on value. Matt, would love your feedback on this. A lot of people said, they saw value as what the customer will pay for. And I thought it was interesting, Matt, because you made a distinction at one point saying value and investing in human value sort of versus customer value. So that may be one area to talk about. And then the other thing that was very consistent too is that both Terry and Jim Boyd had mentioned, I think this combination of it's important to give, how do you show value for feedback that people give? And then how do you use that to mine for untapped capabilities? I think those kind of go hand in hand. So maybe start there around this bucket of how people on the call today thought of value. You know, many people define it within the context of the customers and the customers willing to pay for.
Yeah.
And then part two would really be that how do you really reward people for being brave and honest with their feedback, and then using that to unlock that waste that Jim Boyd described, that untapped capabilities.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I have heard this definition of value before, and I think there's, of course, a ton of merit to essentially value is whatever the customer is willing to pay for. I think that is a definition of value that has a lot of utility, and I think it also, in my opinion, demands a little bit more of an expanded view, because what the customer is willing to pay for can put a tremendous amount of stress on employees and what is being expected of them. And what customers are willing to pay for, in my opinion, really is directly affected by how employees are receiving value from their organization. You know, as we saw with this ecosystem, I'll pull it back up real quick. In our opinion, you know, what customers are willing to pay for is driven directly by what kind of value are employees receiving from their organization. If that missing piece is there, I think that organizations can expect diminished value from customers, because what customers are willing to pay for may not necessarily be provided the way it's supposed to be if employees are struggling with how much value they're receiving from the organization. Yes, and I see James Boyd had this comment here. Okay, value is what the customer is willing to pay for. Everything else is waste. The biggest waste is untapped capability of employees and team members. Yeah, so I think that's very solid. You know, the way I would comment on that is like you were saying, Dave, how do you reward employees for being honest? You know, I think a good way to think about it is, well, what's in it for the employee? Why not just keep your mouth shut and play the game and do what it takes to, you know, not risk anything? And I think, you know, of course, unfortunately, a lot of employees probably see employee feedback that way. They see it as, okay, this is something I have to do. It's something that the manager has to do. Neither one of us really want to be here. So I'm going to say what I need to say and nod my head when I'm supposed to and get out of here. And, you know, what I think is a much more healthy look at employee feedback is, first of all, what can really help encourage employees to be frank and be willing to share a bit more and be a little bit more honest in these employee feedback sessions is to whatever degree they actually trust their manager. That, of course, is absolutely key. So I think an assumption in this is that there is some sort of trusting relationship between the employee and the manager. If there isn't, I do think that there's still an opportunity to work on that. But absolutely, that kind of existing relationship between the employee and manager does need to be reasonably healthy. I would say something else to consider in terms of getting employees to be, let's say, more willing to share that frontline intelligence that we were talking about, is to ensure that you have a culture, and this is really supposed to be part of what lean culture is too, is that you have a culture that encourages problem identification and encourages people to speak up instead of holding back. You know, that's, I think, one of the greatest untapped parts of lean is that in a lot of cases, you know, there might be talk about, okay, yeah, this is a risk-free environment and you can share what you want to share. And if you see waste, report it. But it's a question of really, well, how does that actually get dealt with by the time someone actually does say something? And in a lot of cases, as we all know, maybe someone points out waste and nothing happens, or maybe someone points out waste and they get a huge surprise, and it turns out that there's a lot of finger pointing and blame and politics and all these kinds of things. So I think to experience the benefit of something like frontline intelligence and getting employees to be honest in these sessions requires leading by example and having a culture in which that sort of honesty is normative, as opposed to. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to pick up on something Dick Schroyer had put in the chat around challenges, which is, I think, and then we're going to shift from Dick's comment to a theme of standardization. But I'll start first with the balancing act between, you have that two-pillar Roman pillar thing where the focus on people is a mismatch with process sometimes. Do you ever see it though, where you also over-index on people and then stuff's not getting done? Because I think to Dick Schroer's point, he had said, he has observed where the focus on people can translate to a result of just not a lot of GSD, not a lot of getting stuff done. So how do you make sure that there's not, you maintain that homeostasis between those two pillars as you start to maybe course correct on what can be an under investment in people?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that kind of reminds me of what I saw with WeWork, But I would say more in general, that's why I think the way that we define human value is pretty helpful, because there is the emphasis on the psychological needs of the employees, but another huge part of that is that information flow. And to us, without information, getting stuff done can't really happen. So a big part of, and the two of them really work very nicely together. The point is that if employees are not privy to the information that they need, that's timely, relevant, and accurate, that right there is a non-starter in terms of actually getting stuff done. And what we're saying is that, well, yeah, of course, the sharing of information is important, but also meeting the psychological needs is in some ways a precursor to that sharing of information and can be a consequence of sharing that information as well. So that's one way I would answer that. And the second would be, well, getting stuff done, yes, of course, that needs to happen for the business to stay viable. I think it's just a question of sustainability, though, because if you're turning too far away from taking care of employees and getting stuff done is the primary focus, we all know that there's diminishing returns on that after a while, and that something like the Great Resignation speaks to really what can go wrong with too much of an emphasis on getting stuff done.
Yeah, I want to use Franklin Allen's comment as kind of a pivot to end on this last theme before we wrap up here on the theme of, he mentioned that something he observes sometimes is the uneven distribution of the work. And you're talking about, I hadn't thought about it this way before, Matt, but you talked about information flow. I think as someone who's a project manager for a living, we think a lot about task flow, but we don't talk as much about information flow. So how do you, I guess, see standards being a way to minimize that risk of uneven distribution and to create, because I think the more evenly distributed that work and information is, the safer, the more trust you can have in an environment. That's hard to do. So we had a lot of people, Mark and a few other folks had mentioned this idea of standard work to create that consistency. What are some things you've seen in your experience in your consultancy work where that has been effective to both, again, create that even distribution and to create that consistency through standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think, so someone I want to give credit to where we pulled a lot of the stuff regarding information flow is a lean thought leader, Bob Emilianani. And a lot of what he talked about was very, very helpful to me, particularly as someone, who comes outside of a lean context. But something he made a point of doing that really helped me think through this is, he said that in a lot of cases, leaders essentially function as like a batch and queue type of stop point for information, where really what they should be doing is having a one-piece flow type of transition of information from one person to another. So he, and I agree with him, puts a lot of emphasis on, well, to what degree is information being held politically? To what degree is information being held in such a way that, frankly, some people just don't want to share it, depending on their position in the company. And I think, to answer your question, I think part of what makes information flow work is the ability for everybody to have a clearly defined idea of what is the information that needs to be shared in the first place for everyone to do their job effectively. And we emphasize those three qualities of timeliness, accuracy, and relevancy, because when we started to really think through this, we said, well, really, that's one of those three things, or more than one, is typically the problem, is that people are not getting the information that they need when they need it, or I'm getting a ton of information that's not relevant to what I'm doing, and I'm having to parse through a bunch of stuff. And a lot of times, as we know, sometimes that information cannot be accurate. So you're asking about consistency and how to keep things kind of equally distributed. Well, that part is tough. I think it obviously depends on the organizational structure and what's going on. But I would say if you take kind of like a micro look at it within a team, I definitely lean toward quite a bit of transparency and allowing people to have access to information that concerns them. And what I've seen in my own experience is that people are going to find out information if they really want to get it. And what you don't want is a culture of rumor mongering and, well, so-and-so said this, but I heard this. And, there's like almost like an inner circle of people who have a lot of know and other people who feel like they're looking from the outside in. So that's one of the most common mistakes I've seen.
I want to touch on that. Terry Callan asked a good question, who's from our board and also an expert in the quality field, asked two questions, which I think are relevant to consistency and how to create practices. One was, do you see a role for employee surveys to get feedback about one's culture, or do you prefer in-person feedback sessions? And then two, to have these formal check-ins, these formal feedback sessions and processes, step A, B, and C, or is there also a role for informal conversations and insights? So the first was the tool of an employee survey, and the second was kind of this intermix between formal feedback sessions or the role for informal conversations, which kind of reminds me, for those of you who are on the MIT call last year, those in-between moments that happen between the formal meetings we have. So curious, Matt, what are your thoughts from Terry's questions? And then we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, I know we're running short on time. I'll try to be brief. So yeah, great question, Terry. So first of all, I do think overall employee surveys have a lot of utility. We all know that they have a pretty bad rap at this point, and that they're seen as a bit of an annoyance. In my experience, when I've tried as part of like a culture change team, if I'm a researcher by heart, so I'm like, oh yeah, we got to collect some engagement survey data, and we got to, let's do it at this time, and then in another couple months, and then we'll do it after that. And the typical response is, oh great, another survey. So I do think employee surveys are important. I know a lot of organizations have tools that they already use. I have seen some tools recently that have a much more of a feel of like a pulse survey, where it's a very short, daily, weekly touch point with an employee. So if, in my opinion, something like that is far more effective than just doing like an annual survey where people are going to feel like, all right, I'm going to fill this out and nothing's going to happen. So I would, the first part I would say, yeah, employee surveys are great, but of course, yeah, you're going to want in-person feedback sessions or via Zoom or whatever. The point is you want something face-to-face as well. You don't only want something that's quantitatively analyzed via a survey or qualitatively. Also, this distinction between formal feedback sessions and informal, it's amazing, Terry. You're bringing up something that I was just bringing up with Matt the other day, because this is an important distinction. You can have informal one-on-ones. Hey, you're passing each other in the hallway. Oh yeah, did you get to such and such? So I would say the emphasis of what we're doing and what lends itself toward lean transformation is the formal feedback sessions. But what we would want is for the behaviors learned, specifically regarding human value creation and formal feedback sessions, to spill over into the way managers carry themselves in those informal feedback sessions as well. So you don't want a manager who's spot on in the formal session and then, is brushing you off in the hallway as if like that's like a totally different context. It's still a face-to-face interaction and a touch point. So we do emphasize the formal feedback sessions, but of course recognize that the way those go is going to spill over into the informal ones.
Excellent. Well, we are at time. I want to just remind people to please take a few moments to share your feedback at grqc.org/poll. You can provide some feedback. We like to improve our forums and sessions, and so we look forward to having more participation in some future sessions on both the job search process for employees and how to look for the kind of jobs and the work they want to do, combined with one on the recruitment and onboarding process. And more information can be found at grqc.org with that information. The last thing I would say, and we won't have time to, actually I will share, I'll pull this up quickly, is that some of you have asked, where can I find this great information? We actually have a team, our Community Effectiveness Committee, which is chaired by several of our board members. We have both tools and templates, event presentations from ones just like this you can go and watch, as well as some third-party website links on our website that can be found at grqc.org in the resources section here. And this knowledge center can be a great resource to refresh, get new ideas, and find some people to connect with as you are working through issues related to growth, efficiency, talent, and we look forward to having people attend future sessions. So I want to close up by saying thank you to Matt Della Porta for a very informative discussion. And I think, again, Terry Shreve Pertino, if I mess up your name, I apologize, but you mentioned information as power. And I think, Matt, that's a great way to summarize today, is that information is truly powerful, but we have to put as much time into how to share that information, how to curate that information, and get it to the people who need to. What needs to be shared, in your words, to be effective, and how can we do that? I think Lean Positive, this mix of both the positive psychology trends that are out there today, combined with the things that have always been true about process improvement and quality practices, it's more timely than ever. So thank you. If you want to learn more, Matt, where can people reach you?
Leanpositive.com.
Leanpositive.com. Excellent. So I look forward to, again, grqcpoll.org/poll for feedback, and look forward to seeing many of you at our future sessions on other elements for talent, as well as another session coming up on digital transformation, which is a bit of a diversion from our talent focus, but it will still prove to be a very valuable session on the theme of quality. And I would be remiss in the last minute if I didn't put a plug there. If you have teams that are exceptional at what they do, I encourage you to visit www.grqc.org to learn more about our Performance Excellence Awards and how you can recognize the team and the great contributions they've been making to your organization, for your customers, for your employees over the past several years, and learn more about our Performance Excellence Awards. And those are open until May 27th. So I encourage you to learn more at www.grqc.org. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's session on positive psychology with Matt Della Porta. And on behalf of GRQC, we really appreciate everyone's participation. See you all very soon.